It's 3 minutes after 10. A very good morning to you. I hope you're okay. We dive straight back into the situation in the Middle East, into the bombardment now of the Gaza Strip in retaliation. Respond. Well, there it is. There's the topic, really. Is it retaliation or response? And it will now be civilian casualties and civilian deaths that climb at an exponential rate. Just pause for a moment to reflect upon the scale of the invasion, the massacre undertaken by Hamas. Israeli authorities have reported 1,500 bodies of Hamas fighters found in Israel. So that is an absolute bare minimum of the terrorists who managed to get into one of the most protected territories in the history of humanity. I think it's fair to say. I don't understand the technicalities of somehow almost glitching the Iron Dome so that missiles got through as they hadn't before. But the barbarism, of course, was most evident in the individual encounters, of which more details have emerged since we last spoke yesterday. And they are... I don't know why we use the word medieval when we're describing barbarism. It's not as if it went out of fashion for 600 or 700 years, is it? There were terrible things going on all over the world long after the medieval ages. But we do, don't we? We use it as a sort of synonym for a kind of level of violence that we think is unfamiliar or alien. It isn't. It isn't, but whether it's the children or the young women being carted off on motorbikes and paraded through territory, I don't know. But another thing we don't know, and I hope that some people perhaps we took some calls yesterday from Israel itself, I hope some more people listening in Israel will help me out with one side of this conversation today, because I'm seeing a lot of criticism. Haaretz, which is a big Israeli newspaper, very, very critical of Netanyahu, of Benjamin Netanyahu. We'd had a guest yesterday from the Royal United Services Institute who pointed out that whenever and listen, I'm just a human being using words, all right? So if I was about to use the word incursion, and as soon as I felt the word incursion forming in the back of my mind, I thought that's not quite the right word. This is, for me at least, uncharted territory. I've covered terrorist attacks that were self-contained. I haven't covered atrocities with a tail as long as this one will have in anything like or at anything like the level that we will have to do with this one. So invasion rather than incursion. But previous instances of comparable behaviour have always seen the head of the government fall, he explained to us yesterday. But Netanyahu is a different character, isn't he? He's a sort of unprecedented leader of Israel, and it is being suggested in some quarters that arrogance or obsession with other issues may have contributed to the lack of vigilance that saw this astonishing invasion in circumstances that literally nobody foresaw. William Hague writes rather impressively in the Times today about that specifically, about the absolute again, I hear the word success forming in the back of my mind, but that feels like the wrong word to use, doesn't it? Let me just read you what he wrote. To pull off such a feat. See what I mean? Feat, achievement, success. But it was, from their point of view, I suppose, a successful attack. To pull off such a feat will have required absolute secrecy among a tiny leadership group, giving last-minute orders to their followers and working only by word of mouth. But here is the line that I was alluding to a moment ago. It also needed complacency and distraction in Israel's leadership. So complacency and distraction in Israel's leadership, I think you'd struggle to describe that as responsibility for the attacks. But again, we're on that thin line between explanation and excuse. If you want to understand how it happened in the way that it happened, then you would have to accommodate what William Hague describes as complacency and distraction in Israel's leadership. He also warns against the dangers of Israel falling into a trap that Hamas has set. And that is the bit that we're going to talk about today. It's one analysis. I think he's a former shadow foreign secretary, isn't he, Hague? Maybe. Anyway, the point is he is a an astute observer of international relations and somebody who would once have been close to a position of major influence on our role in these sort of matters. And I've chosen him as our entry point because, well, I found his analysis persuasive, but I also found the questions he both asks and answers quite chilling. So why launch an indiscriminate assault on a vastly superior military power? Why expose the 2 million Palestinians in the crowded space of Gaza to Israel inevitably trying to crush Hamas and restore order? Why, as well as murdering hundreds of defenseless young people at a rave, parade dead bodies as evidence of the atrocities? These are the questions that can be answered, need to be answered, will be answered in days, just over a couple of days and weeks. The bigger questions of how this happened, that could take years. That will be the focus of soul-searching and inquiries for years to come. But the answer William Hague offers up, and it's a fairly straightforward answer, is that the objective of Hamas is uncontrolled rage. And that is something that Hague suggests would be a mistake. It is to make Israel lash out in a way that starts a conflagration, to start a war so intense that it spreads, igniting an explosion of violence in the West Bank, bringing in Hezbollah from Lebanon in the north. There's already signs of that happening, exposing Israel to fighting on multiple fronts. You will then see so many Palestinians killed that the Israelis lose the moral high ground of defending themselves against mass murder. And that, I think, is the area that interests me most this morning. The point at which Israel would lose the moral high ground, the difference between retribution and response. Foreign Secretary, of course he was, thank you, Mark, between 2010 and 2014. That is fascinating and important, and arguably has ramifications way beyond the Middle East. There's also, of course, and the reason why it is a priority for Hamas to do this, to do the big picture response, to seek this sort of apocalyptic conflict, is because they want to stop this creeping collaboration between Israel and Arab states. The sort of normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi and some other countries. You then use the hostages with maximum cruelty to create a sort of frenzy of hatred on both sides. And 11 minutes after 10 is the time. And the language of Netanyahu is very much of a piece with this notion of a frenzy of hatred on both sides, uncontrolled rage in Israel's response. I think Hague's right, but I don't know what the alternative is. I don't know what Israel's response should be that we could reasonably describe as, well, what would be too much? 034560600973. So this line between, Hague puts it very well when he simply talks about losing the moral high ground. I guess you would count almost civilian deaths, wouldn't you? But if you can prove that civilian deaths are occurring in pursuit of terrorists, then you have a different moral proposition from civilian deaths for no sort of grander motive. I just don't know. I mean, the three words we used yesterday, and they were the right words to use, and thank you for all your kind words about the way that we managed to navigate Tamar's call, which opened proceedings yesterday. I was at a funeral yesterday, actually, after the programme. I'll tell you a little more about the wonderful man that we said goodbye to later in the programme, but people were coming up to me at a funeral, the wake afterwards, to talk about that call, people who'd heard it, and people who'd heard, one woman I met whose cousin was here from Israel had listened to it in the taxi on the way into town from the airport, and been absolutely hypnotized by that contribution. If you didn't listen to it, you really should have done. So thank you for that. And yesterday, those three words that we focused on were correct: unthinkable, unjustifiable, indefensible. And I said to you yesterday, today is not the day for asking bigger questions. And today is not the day for challenging any of those descriptions. Unthinkable, indefensible, unjustifiable. That's describing the actions of Hamas, the actions of the terrorists. But when would Israel's actions become unjustifiable? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that when William Hague talks about deliberately provoking Israel to a position where they cede the moral high ground in this case, is probably Hamas's plan. They want uncontrolled rage. And yet I don't really see what else Israel can do. 10:14 is the time. 0345 60 973 is the number that you need. And listen, there are people, there were some, you need to be careful, particularly when right-wing media in this country gets an opportunity to sort of use the word leftist as a synonym for Hamas support. I think Keir Starmer's made it clear that the Labour Party is categorically no longer an organisation to which that accusation can be levelled, but it won't stop the Daily Mail and others from doing it. A lot of the protests in London were in support of and defence of Palestinian people. If someone is protesting solidarity with Palestinian people, they are not protesting support for Hamas. You have to be morally corrupt or deeply, deeply dishonest to conflate the two. Let's be absolutely clear about that. You show me someone celebrating Hamas, there's atrocities, and it did happen, and there is footage of it, but it's a relatively negligible number of people. David Aranovich is very strong on this, currently on Twitter, but no doubt shortly on his blog as well. But there's a big difference between that and expressing enormous compassion and sympathy for the 2 million civilians who are now facing the wrath of Israel, the wrath of an Israeli government that is bloodied and embarrassed, bloodied and humiliated. And that's the point, isn't it? That's the point about uncontrolled rage. It's the casualties and the deaths, it's the grief and the bereavement and the horror. But for politicians, there's humiliation here. There's humiliation at home. And somehow, this is where diplomacy and the international community, and even, I suppose, in a small way, journalism, this is where those phenomena become, in a way, checks and balances. Nobody is going to say that Israel, to use a biblical analogy, nobody is going to say that Israel should turn the other cheek on this occasion. But equally, what does an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth look like? What would parity look like? What would a reasonable response look like? How much is too much? At what point does Israel, in the specific context of this terror attack, reach a point where a truly fair-minded and objective observer would say that you or she has now gone too far? I have no clue. Sorry, sometimes when I start talking to you at 3 minutes after 10, I get towards the question that we're going to wrestle with together by around about 15, a little later usually. And I feel a little answer, or the beginnings of an answer to that question beginning to form in my own mind. I thought I would, or I hoped that I would today, but I haven't got a clue. I recommend that you read Haig's piece in the Times. And I recommend, if you can, that you have a look at the Haaretz website for just a reminder for those of us over here of what some Israeli media looks like, because it doesn't look very like our right-wing media in this country. Be deeply, deeply aware of the difference between expressing compassion and solidarity for Palestinian civilians and expressing support for acts of terrorism. I mean, it's tragic that I have to point that out, but I can tell from my inbox already that I do. In fact, speaking of my inbox, first text, top text in, just the most recent text to land, simply says what Israel needs to do, exactly to do, is to turn the other cheek. And in a way, you're right. But we both know that's never going to happen. So how much is too much? Where should this response end? Where should it reach? Where should it end? And I'll tell you something for nothing. Nobody knows. I'm not going to start channeling Donald Rumsfeld, but nobody knows whether Hezbollah, I suppose Hezbollah leaders might, but nobody knows whether Israel's going to be fighting on two fronts. Nobody knows what impact this is going to have. Nobody knows for sure what this will do to the creeping collaboration between Israel and Arab states. But what Hamas wants to do is essentially bring down the ceiling on the whole region, including themselves and the people for whom they claim they are fighting. Those are William Hague's words, not mine. And I think to understand that, you need to understand the mentality of a suicide bomber almost, whether they're expecting heavenly rewards or whether they are just caught up in their own earthly status. I don't know. But without constant conflict, there is no Hamas. It's what they exist for. If someone once said to me, well, I think it was you actually, you said to me that if Hamas stops fighting, there's peace. If Israel stops fighting, they get obliterated. It might be a little simplistic, but I find it helpful. 10:19 is the time. The phone lines are open. The question is simple. The answers will not be. How much is too much? Where would you draw the line between response and retribution, where retribution is not moral, but response clearly is? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's just coming up to 10:20. 22 minutes after 10. I mean, I don't know how much of the footage you've seen. People with family in Israel are obviously watching it a lot more closely and in a lot more detail than the rest of us. A friend of mine who flew back earlier this week, she was celebrating her dad's birthday in Israel, is watching a particularly traumatic piece of footage where a girl in her early 20s came on air pleading for help as her father was taken hostage to Gaza whilst trying to protect her mother and grandmother, and she can now watch him handcuffed in his underpants being paraded up and down the streets of Gaza on social media. I mention this because this line in Hague's piece about them deliberately trying to provoke the most apocalyptic response, it throws all your sort of tanky attempts to bring false equivalence or whataboutery to this into complete disarray. I mean, generally, we're talking about a constituency of contributors to British discourse who are too stupid to understand some of the problems that they face. It doesn't stop their sort of arrogant certainties. But Hamas parading people deliberately up and down the street, that is designed to provoke an even more violent response than Israel might be currently minded to undertake. That seems to me to be crucial to understanding the bigger picture. So I accept that on a day like today I need to wade through millions of texts telling me that Israel has never had the moral high ground, and people managing to excuse the events of this weekend without realizing that that's what they're doing. I get that. That's fine. You know, I'm ugly enough and old enough to deal with that, but you've got to look at what they're doing. It's not just the massacre of young people, that the indiscriminate murder of young people, it's the deliberate aftermath, the humiliations, the paradings, hostage takings, not just as human shield, but as deliberate attempts to unleash uncontrolled rage. And the more uncontrolled the rage is, the thesis that we're exploring today, the more fragile Israel's claim to any right of or any access to moral high ground becomes. It's horrible, right? It's absolutely horrible, which is why I don't know what the answer to any of the questions I've asked is. And you need to remind me on days like today that if you don't have a really, really good answer to the question, I'm not allowed to get impatient with you like I sometimes do on phone. Let's go to Mark, who's in Reading. Mark, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I think the first thing I wanted to say is I think William Hague is right on this, and that's quite a rare thing for me to say. But I think his analysis that a massive part of this is in order to provoke a response. I think people need to really, really think on that, because my answer to your question is admittedly an incredibly naive and idealistic one.
Sure.
But what I think from now on, from bearing in mind everything that's happened, I think the best thing the Israeli government could do for its people is to say, we're going to be targeted about this. We're not going to, lash out in an indiscriminate way because something heinous has been done to our people. We're going to, and unfortunately it will take a long time, but Israel has got one of the best security services in the world. I'm sure they would have the support of other Western security services if they needed it. And they said, we will take the time to, in a targeted way, go after the people that have done this to us.
Wouldn't that, to an Israeli, and indeed to many observers, wouldn't that just sound like business as usual?
I don't think it would be business as usual in terms of the immediate aftermath. I think that would look very different from what I, as an observer, and what I think most people in the region would expect Israel to normally do, which is what's already started happening with the shelling of Gaza. I think a pause and a saying, no one's getting away with this, but we're going to do it in a measured way. And hopefully, alongside that, there can be, again, with the support of the international community, there can be moves towards actually resolving this, rather than continuing the cycle.
That's why I use the phrase business as usual. So I understand the point that you're making, but this terror attack wouldn't really change anything from one perspective, would it? Because you're simply going after people who were already leaders of Hamas, albeit that the urgency perhaps of that pursuit has changed as a consequence of the terror attack, but the identity of the individuals hasn't. And if I was a grieving Israeli, I'd be like, why should I trust these people to get the culprits when the culprits got the better of us on Saturday on such a grim scale?
Really, really good point. And I would hope that with all the expertise that Israel has, and even though they have absolutely been caught out, right?
Yes.
You would hope that given the time, they could get some of the people to show that this isn't going to go unpunished, but we're going to move forward in a different way now. And as I probably came to the point quite late, it's got to be alongside how do we sort
with
out
some
the
sort
wider
of
problem.
international coalition and pursue. Well, that will be interesting, won't it, when they talk about complacency and distraction in Israel's leadership in recent months, if not years. That has been the opposite direction of traffic from the one they undertake. And on that question, actually, of indiscriminate was a word Mark used. A confusion yesterday from the Israeli government at one point urging people in Gaza to cross into Egypt over I think it's called the Rafah crossing, R-A-F-A-H, and then withdrawing the information. It was open when we gave the advice, seemed to be the sort of state of play yesterday evening, but it's closed now. I don't fully understand that either. It gets horribly overlooked in a lot of the... So again, I understand why people queue up to condemn Israel, even on days like today, even at times like this, but the refusal of Egypt to open that crossing from the Gaza Strip is something that, again, these people often seem too stupid to understand the relevance or the importance of. But yeah, I'm glad Mark's introduced the word indiscriminate into the conversation, and I guess that underpins all the questions that I'm asking. Well, what does discriminate response look like as opposed to indiscriminate? And if you're telling civilians, whether it's a permanent piece of advice or a temporary one, you're telling civilians to get out and then admitting later in the day that they can't. Just think for a moment about what that says. You've got to get out. Why? Well, because otherwise you could get killed, even though you're blameless. Okay, I can't get out. The crossing's closed now. And the people who told me to get out are the people that are going to be... So there it is, right? In a single nutshell, in two different releases from the same government department. An illustration of what's at stake here, an illustration of what William Hague and many, many others are talking about when they describe this as a trap set by Hamas into which Israel currently seems set to run headlong. It is 10:30. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 10:34 is the time. You've got to help me be patient on days like today, not least because I haven't got answers to most of the questions that I'm asking, but also because I keep forgetting about catch-up. So you heard the last words I said before the news about the Rafah crossing from Gaza into Egypt and the relevance of that, and indeed the rather chilling nature of yesterday's announcement that the Palestinians in Gaza should use it to get into Egypt, almost or else. There's a sort of silent or else at the end of that information, and then having to retract the instruction later in the day because the crossing was closed. And then this is the text at the top of my inbox. The only way to, I beg your pardon, we are not mentioning that Egypt also has a border with Gaza. Egypt could have opened up. Other Arab neighbours could have opened up for people to get out. That's literally the last thing I said, but I appreciate lots of people listening on Catch Up these days. It's almost as if time itself is being broken by technology. 10:35 is the time. Gabriella is in Mill Hill. Gabriella, what would you like to say?
Hi, I am obviously British and I have just left Israel. We managed to get out yesterday.
Deliberately, or were you scheduled to come home anyway?
We were scheduled to come home. Actually, this is quite an interesting point. We were scheduled to come home anyway yesterday. All our flights were cancelled. This is one actual important thing to talk about because there are many British citizens who are stuck there now. British Airways basically are only sort of taking crew home as opposed to, they will run those flights taking people out, but they're not actually putting on very helpful flights. They cancelled our flight. They cancelled my parents' flight.
Yes. Did you come via Turkey?
Absolute chaos. No, we were booked to come via Prague. We booked it last minute. We've got two small children. We booked to come via Prague. We got to the airport. We got to the front of this ridiculous, as you can imagine, security line. And then when we got to the front, they told us our flight had been cancelled 5 minutes beforehand.
Whoa, okay.
And then, luckily, and I would actually advise it to anyone who's listening who has any family who are stuck in Israel right now, the only way we could get out is actually just being physically at the airport and speaking to people at the El Al, which is the Israeli airline desk, and telling them basically get us onto any flight with any cancellation.
Any plane that's taking off, we want to be on it.
Yeah.
I was told yesterday that Turkey was one of the destinations to which planes were still
I think
flying.
people are going absolutely anywhere. I think people are going to Dubai, going to all sorts of places you can even imagine just to get home or even out as opposed to home, if that makes sense.
Indeed, it does. What would you like to say? What made you pick up the phone?
So, what made me pick up the phone is I heard the caller who was just on recently talking about how Israel should have a sort of targeted response, and it was almost like he didn't want to say it because it's so hard to sort of even clarify what a targeted response would even look like. And I think one thing I want to say as a Jewish person and as a British person is it's very hard for us as Brits to understand what a targeted response would even look like. Yes. I think what people here need to understand is the Gaza Strip is run by Hamas. Hamas are using civilians as shields. They put them they put rocket launchers in hospitals, in mosques. It is impossible. And I'm not, this is not even going against what this man has said. I appreciate that sounds like a rational sort of reaction. But how do you effectively target this overpopulated place where they have rocket launchers from every which way? They have Hamas terrorists hiding in tunnels. Clearly this was a huge security error on the Israeli side, but they don't know. I don't think they know how to use a targeted response. I don't think they are still making announcements.
So what's the alternative?
To leave. I don't think there is an alternative apart from warning people to get out of buildings as they currently are from, buildings where they know that there are civilians, saying you've got an hour to get out and we're going to bomb it. That's the only way I think right now they're going to do it. It's unpleasant. It's horrific. I hate seeing pictures of Gazan children suffering. I also hate the fact that they've got no hospitals and no proper sort of resources because Hamas has spent all their money on rockets and terror tunnels.
No prospect of getting out either. I mean,
no prospect of getting out. But then again, like you said about Egypt,
yes, but that's closed.
They don't want them either because do they want their country infiltrated by Hamas? Probably not really.
No, I presume that's a large part of the rationale. I mean, the problem is that the young people, and I think the population of Gaza that's under 18 is among the highest in the world. The young people who are currently not radicalised, who rush out of those buildings shortly before the bombs drop, and also if the warning comes in,
and it's increasing the cycle of violence. I see it.
They're tomorrow's terrorists or tomorrow's freedom
100%.
fighters, as they would describe themselves. But also with the warnings in place, Why wouldn't the terrorists leave the buildings as well?
You're making an excellent point. I don't have any answers to those sorts of questions.
It's quite an important
my
one.
point was just more about, and I guess, look, this is why I'm thinking ground invasion is inevitable, because they know that they're hiding in all sorts of bases. They'd rather have their children killed than to give up, Hamas leadership bases. And also, there's another issue, which is obviously there's so many hostages in there that the airstrikes are clearly not going to be the long-term situation here. Like, there is going to be a ground invasion in the next few days, and it's not going to help the situation, long term. It's going to be awful. But
nothing is going to help the situation.
What can they do?
I don't know. I promised I wouldn't get impatient with people for not being able to answer the question, but
having just been in Israel, I think the collective shock and grief of this nation, where in terms of the numbers of people, elderly women, children, women who've been raped. I mean, it's so unbelievable and so brutal. And everyone knows someone who's been kidnapped. I mean, can you even imagine that happening in the UK? So talking about tolerance and restraint, that word restraint is an interesting one, because what does that even mean?
I think you're the first person to use that word today on this program, at least.
It's interesting because I've seen it quite a lot on social media where people say we hope that Israel can act with restraint.
But you're saying that,
imagine them saying that to
Gabriella,
the UK.
Listen, I understand everything you're saying, and you're right. I can only imagine the emotional investment that you and many others have, but you are saying in terms that because of the appalling atrocities inflicted upon completely innocent people by Hamas, there should be no restraint in inflicting atrocities on completely innocent people by Israel.
I didn't say there should be no restraint. I said
you objected to the use of the word restraint.
Because it's an impossible thing to quantify. And I think you can agree with that.
Well, it isn't, though, is it? You've just quantified it. You've just described the atrocities. You've used incredibly powerful and accurate language about rape and torture and parading people through the streets.
I don't think Israelis who are doing airstrikes are thinking of this necessarily, and I'm sure many are. I'm sure there are many people who've been, directly affected in the south, for example, who look at this and they are thinking probably an eye for an eye. I completely see that.
Or two eyes for an eye.
The majority of Israelis who are very left-leaning just are thinking, how can we flatten Hamas? How can we completely get rid of all that infrastructure? And there is no real answer. Look, let's face it.
Well, this is when we're back to where we started. We're back to where we started because you take out the modern iteration of Hamas, and they're back tomorrow with either different identity, different individuals under a different name. I don't know. Nobody knows.
As per the last caller, when he spoke about a more targeted response, I do think a ground invasion is going to provide that more targeted response. It's going to be appalling.
And then the death toll of completely innocent people heads ever upwards, doesn't it?
Oh, and the death toll of Israeli soldiers will be enormous. It is a massive sacrifice. But what has just happened? They need to prevent it from happening again. It is awful.
There it is. What does success look like?
Well, there's this, as far as I can see it, it's already been a victory for Hamas. So there's not going to be any
response.
What
does the success of the response look like?
I think everyone is viewing success in a different way. So
I'm asking you.
Not being removed. For success, it's to sort of make sure the borders are more secure. It is absolutely not about ensuring that we don't have another generation of hate, because we're going to get that anyway. I really think the damage has already been done over years and years of this.
On both sides.
And on both sides. But I will say that one thing we're not taking into account is the music festival that was made. Most of the people there were pacifists.
Yes, I know.
I mean, and actually the kids, and just this morning, the stories that are coming out, because obviously they've been sort of very, very slow to hit mainstream media, and they've sort of been circulated as people looking for family members. First, it reminds me a bit of 9/11. Is whole families being taken and people seeing them on the back of sort of cattle trucks being paraded through Gaza. I'm not saying that this is going to solve anything. I don't think there's going to be any good sort of long-term outcome here.
No, I don't think there is either.
Feeling in Israel is it feels very united right now. They don't even really care about whether they get sort of the international sign-off here. They're going to do whatever they can to protect their people.
And yet, as if we've established anything in this conversation, I mean, protecting the people is close to nebulous and almost certainly impossible in any long-term meaningful way. So that's why I asked what success will look like. And quite a few people reminding me, and you, Gabriella, of the old phrase that an eye for an eye makes everyone blind, which I feel, simplistic but oddly appropriate. It's 11:15. 10:48 is the time, and again, this seems to be pretty apposite to me. The paradox is that both sides believe that only more deaths will bring peace, and it's an unshakable belief based on their own existence. And there is some truth in the notion that even people who are not either in Hamas or in the IDF think that actions are justified by events, justified by circumstances. But I don't know where the line is. I know that it's. I mean, you've got the Geneva Convention, you've got international law, you've got United Nations, you've even got right back to St. Augustine asking questions about what is a just war? Can there be such a thing as a just war? But, if civilians are being killed, then the moral dimension at the moment just seems to be the celebratory element of it, the parading through streets, the relish, as opposed to perhaps seeing it as an unpleasant duty. But the death is the same. The death doesn't change according to the mood or the motivation of the killer, does it? Just something Gabriella said that a few of you have picked up on. I'm not sure it's ever been established that Hamas fire rockets from mosques and or schools. The most recent report I could find is 10 years old, and it involves. Well, the Israelis kept saying rockets were fired from schools or hospitals when in fact they were fired 200 or 300 meters away. Still, there were some mistakes made and they were quickly dealt with. That's a spokesman speaking to the Associated Press 10 years ago. But it's the first acknowledgement that by a Hamas official that in some cases rockets had been fired from near residential areas or civilian facilities. That's the only reference to it I could find. But this struck me. This is a paragraph, and just to stress perhaps the intractability of it all. This is almost exactly 10 years old. This is from September 2014, but it could be from today or tomorrow. The questions lie at the heart of a brewing international legal confrontation. Did Hamas deliberately and systematically fire rockets at Israel from homes, hospitals and schools in the hope that Israel would be deterred from retaliating, as Israel claims? Or did Israel use force excessively, resulting in deaths among people not involved in combat operations? And that, I think, might be, brutal though it is, the question that underpins all of the next few days. The question of deaths among people not involved in combat operations. The response to deaths among people not involved in combat operations will be more deaths among people not involved in combat operations. I know that's how wars work, but it sounds mad, doesn't it, when you put it in those sort of terms. How are we going to respond to the deaths among people not involved in combat operations? We're going to respond with more deaths among people not involved in combat operations. And the likelihood of any sort of meaningful resolution seems to me to be highly unlikely, although I will bite your arm off if you can offer up a more optimistic analysis. Mark's in Bristol. Mark, what would you like to say?
Okay, well, you nailed it, James. Just to give you a little background, I am a British citizen, British-Israeli citizen. I was a paratrooper 100 years ago in the Israeli army. I've been in situations like this.
Gosh.
I also, just to give the other side, I also co-founded with 3 musicians from Gaza in 1998 the first Palestinian-Israeli music band ever, I think, definitely a rock and roll band, called White Flag, and that name was given by one of the Palestinians, I may add, the name White Flag to the band. There is no resolution in what's going to go on. The angst and the anger and the fear and the hate is of course, driving emotions now in Israel, led by a government who's totally ineffectual, which is the scariest thing of all. In my opinion, the central, most scary issue is that we have a bunch of very incompetent people, including people in positions of security leadership who have never actually served a day in their lives in armies in Israel. If it was possible to pinpoint and take out the Hamas, I would support that.
Yes.
I'm not some deep pacifist who's we shouldn't respond. It's not going to happen. I was speaking to one of my co-bandmates from Gaza. He's not in Gaza anymore. He managed to get asylum in another country. I'm not going to say any names because there are people there still from my band. And I have my nephews sitting in troops around the border of Gaza right now. So I'm truly stuck between a stone and a hard place because I know people everywhere.
Yes.
There is going to be no solution and no destroying of the Hamas. As my friend told me last night, there's a city under a city in Gaza. They have tunnels and secret spaces, which is going to be impossible to get to. How do you deal with it? There is, of course, only one solution. This is going to sound fantastically naive and stupid. The world has allowed, sadly, Israel, who I want to make clear to all those people who are screaming and saying you're a traitorous Israeli right now. The world years ago should have imposed kind of not sanctions or whatever the word should be on Israel to get out of the occupied territories, of course, because we've created an impossible situation in the Middle East. And but the tragedy. Let's go back to what is a reasonable response. Well, people dying, innocent people on any level is not a reasonable response because innocent people are going to die. So, the bottom line is, do we legitimize killing to a certain point or where do we draw the line?
Well, that's
an eye
it.
for an eye, as you were saying before. And nobody has the answer to this. And when emotions are high, of course, and I'm sitting here and I'm feeling my blood pumping around my body, being emotional and trying to be sensible. So there is only one solution, which is a long-term solution, which demands international intervention. The fear of if you're anti, or if you call out Israel equated to anti-Semitism is an extraordinarily complicated international issue now,
and largely unhelpful, I think, because
completely unhelpful.
Particularly at the moment, the critiques of the current government from within Israel are both loud and detailed, and I think you'd be part of that process. Can I ask you a question relevant to that point, which is, and listen, this will be pure opinion. Nobody knows what the future holds, but you obviously follow events more closely than I do. Inevitably, how fearful are you that Netanyahu's response will be informed by the sense of humiliation and shame, that he will not be acting in a kind of, he'll be less sensible than he would have been if this attack, this incursion, this invasion had not been so embarrassing for him. Do you see what I mean? How can how fearful are you that he will not be able to separate the personal humiliation from the military response?
He's not going to be able at all. We only have to watch his behavior over the last 10 years. Listen, this is a guy who's been in power, give or take, since 2009. He had a year's break here and there to go and recuperate and get his ducks in a row again. You have to understand there's a basic thing that many people don't understand about Israel. There's a word in Hebrew which is called bitchonis. Bitchonis comes from the word bitachon, which means security. Israel is fundamentally, as a community, quite a center-left, socially aware nation. Sadly, the situation in Israel, and many legitimate reasons to fear for their personal security and their survival, and this is absolutely true, has allowed many people who would normally vote left and center to vote right because they believe, like in the UK, we tend to believe the Conservatives are better with money than their left. The equation is in Israel that the right wing have got the
defense.
What's the word? They've got defense down better than the left wing. Even though I may add that both of those are under threat this week, aren't they? Both of those positions, the British one and the Israeli one. Well, there you go. Yeah. So weirdly, I know quite a lot about British politics, but I don't want to go there. But weirdly, if you look at the great successes, and I may add the odd failure, like the Yom Kippur, the October War, exactly 50 years ago, the greatest victories were left by people who were generals leading, who then became prime ministers, like Rabin. So they were left. So once again, there is a contradiction in the truth and the story that's told. But the sad thing, let's get back to the issue.
Well, we're going to run out of time, so you'll need to be brief now, Mark.
Right. So sadly, the bottom line is they will not be able to destroy Hamas.
But there will be blood.
But there will be terrible blood. that the question is, where does that leave us as far as the realpolitik,
Well, I
as we
don't
like
know.
to say, and the future of Israel? Nor do I. There is only one solution. I'll finish with this.
Yeah, go on. What is it?
You've got to. There is only one solution, which is world powers coming along and say to Israel, until you start dealing with the peace issue in the West Bank in the occupation, this is going to go on and on and on. And we have to start moving into another.
So the road,
we can't let them get away with
the traffic. The direction then would be towards enshrining Palestinian statehood in some sense, or not?
In some sense or another, and how that would express itself is, not people. Well, I don't know, wiser than me. I don't see many, but people who in theory are wiser than me, coming up with solutions. But this is just going to, and it can conflate the whole region, and that undoubtedly is what's pushing.
There it is.
They want Iran and the Hezbollah on, and
to
they
come
want
in. Well, that's the phrase, isn't it, about provoking uncontrolled rage, and that's very helpful. Thank you. Just to clarify for people tuning in, perhaps halfway through your call, you've served in the Israeli army yourself. You've served in the Israeli.
I was a paratrooper. It's kind of weird to be a musician and a paratrooper. There you go.
Maybe there should be more of that, Mark, and the world would be a different place. It's coming up to 10:59. Once again, I'm humbled by the quality of contribution to the programme today, and the nature of this conversation is such that there's not going to be anything close to consensus, but that except perhaps in the area of futility. But if it was your house into which someone had just marched and behaved abominably, you would not consider every response to be futile. You'd consider some responses to be both necessary and inevitable. It's coming up to 11 o'clock. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and we'll continue this conversation from a number of perspectives, but chiefly, how do you define a reasonable response in the context of civilian death? I'm not sure you can, actually. 3 minutes after 11 is the time, and if you think some of the issues we're tackling are big, try this one on for size from Gary, and this is a widely expressed view as well. My fear is that Israel, with the support of Saudi Arabia, will now target Iran. There's so much at play. Just on a lighter note, two texts that arrived within moments of each other. This one referencing Mark, our last caller. James, that caller you had on just before the news is one of the most balanced, conscious contributions I've ever heard towards this conversation, which was nice. And at the same time, exactly the same time, actually, looking at the timestamp, John texted, "Why don't you shut up?" So you can't please. They said you can't please all of the people all of the time. I think we provide conclusive and irrefutable proof of that on a daily basis. Quick mention of something domestic. Obviously, the Labour Party conference in Liverpool is underway. I find it very hard to tear my attention away from events in the Middle East because they are so horrible and because they have potentially such astonishing reverberations and ramifications, but we must try in the course of the week and possibly in the course of the day. But the most remarkable thing has happened with regard to Rishi Sunak's speech last week. Do you remember that long list of announcements that he made about where money saved by cancelling HS2 from Manchester to Birmingham would instead be spent? Do you remember that? I think you could call it a central platform of his entire conference speech, couldn't you, reasonably? Well, they weren't announcements at all. There was no intention of delivering them. I mean, some of them had already been announced before. Some of them, and not for the first time, I find myself wondering what this story would look like if we didn't have a print media that is 80% sycophantic towards the Tory party, whoever is in charge, and a broadcast media that is either part of the problem or kind of tied to the medium, tied to the way that the newspapers still sadly set so much of the agenda for everybody else, from newspaper reviews on BBC programmes right through to me relying on newspapers to decide what I'm going to talk about in the morning. We managed to plough our own furrow, but the agenda, we are seagulls, not trawlers, I think, most days. But imagine if you had a print media, imagine if you had 4 newspapers that were either broadly impartial, broadly independent, or lent slightly towards the Labour Party at the moment. How do you think the fact that the long list of announcements that Rishi Sunak made in his speech has been disowned after it emerged that some of the stuff had already been announced, and some of it was already in place, not just already announced. Some of it already existed. I think there was a link in Manchester to the airport, was it? I forget the precise details. It's been there for about 5 years. But what has subsequently been established, that these were illustrative ideas for projects that, quotes, could be funded. So when he stood up and made that long list of things he was going to spend the HS2 money on, they weren't actually things that he's going to spend the HS2 money on. They were things that he could spend the HS2 money on. They were sort of illustrative. Well, I don't say sort of. That's the word that's been used. Illustrative. Victoria Derbyshire completely barbecued that absolute oaf Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, on the telly on Sunday morning. And he described it as we gave some examples about the sorts of things that money could be spent on. And she did something I have been waiting the best part of a decade for BBC journalists to do. She pulled the document out of her hat, not literally, and said to him, no, they were not illustrations. These are announcements. I've got the document here. Some of the stuff you've announced has already happened. Some of it has already been announced. And all of it, according to Mark Harper, was not actually an announcement at all. It was merely an illustration of the sort of thing that we might actually spend the money on. So if you are living according to Rishi Sunak's moral compass, and you're at work today, you don't actually have to do anything. If it's your job perhaps to, I don't know, take the bins out, all 7 of them, you don't have to. You're taking the bins out. It's just an illustration of the kind of thing that you might do if you turn up for work today. So what you're going to do, you're going to make a speech at 10 o'clock when you get into the office or you get into the shop, and you're going to make a long list of all the things that you're going to say, these are all the things I'm going to do today. And when the boss comes to check on you at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and she says quite rightly, you haven't done this and you haven't done that, you've not done the numbers, you haven't done your sales figures, you haven't restocked the bathrooms, you haven't put the shirts out on the shelves, you haven't audited the sales for last set. And you said, no. When I said that I was going to do these things today, I simply offered up illustrations of the kind of things I could do today if I wanted to. And now, when I said I was actually going to do these things, all of these things, I did not mean to give the impression that I was actually going to do all of these things when I said that I was going to do all of these things. I was merely offering up some illustrative ideas of things that could be done today by me. So what have you done? Nothing, mate, boss, sir, madam, nothing at all. I've done nothing. That's where we are now. I haven't plugged my book for a while, so I will now, because this is absolutely crucial to the thesis of my new book, How They Broke Britain. The way that reality itself has been completely broken. So a prime minister, remember, not only have you got people like Mark Harper engaging in sort of far-right conspiracy theories about 15-minute cities and what have you, but an actual prime minister who promised professionalism, accountability and integrity can stand up in front of an actual Tory conference and announce a list of actual promises, actual destinations for money saved by cancelling the link between Manchester and Birmingham on HS2, and then within days, not months or years, it's not like Johnson's hospitals, the 40 hospitals that will never be built or were never actually going to be new hospitals at all. It's not like that, where it takes months or years for the truth to emerge. Within days, this long list of announcements has been rendered redundant. Because they were not announcements at all. They were illustrative ideas for projects that could be funded, not necessarily projects that would receive any funding. I think that's incredible, frankly. I think we're living in the, what's it called in Stranger Things, the upside down. I think we're living in the upside down. You expect this kind of madness from populists and chancellors like Farage, but like hecklers, you can heckle this kind of crud from the back of the room. You can't be on the actual stage peddling it. But there we are. 10 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Back from domestic politics, although we will catch up with some of the events in Liverpool today shortly, and back to international politics, and the kind of international politics, of course, that can have astonishing ramifications around the world. Paul in Manchester makes an excellent point about these comparisons with 9/11, which I understand, and even with Pearl Harbor. But 9/11 in particular surely provides the world, says Paul, with a masterclass in how not to respond to a terrorist attack. He's kind of got a point, hasn't he? And yet here we are. Hassan is in Leeds. Hassan, what would you like to say?
Hi there. Good morning, James.
Hello,
okay?
mate. Very good. What's on your mind?
I only felt compelled to actually ring in just because you sounded so well-meaning in yesterday's monologue, and I just hope you don't mind if I slightly push back on some of the points, and hopefully you can understand.
I mean,
a slightly different perspective.
No, of course I will, and I will listen. But this is today's show.
Oh, sorry. No, it was just more on the point about this notion that you can't contextualise such atrocities, basically.
But that's yesterday's programme.
Okay, and is it not relevant to today with regards to...
Well, it is, but I mean, I've got no way of knowing how many people listening now would have been listening yesterday.
Okay.
But you can't, I mean, you're here now, and I don't want to sound rude, so but by all means, contribute to yesterday's programme today.
Okay, my apologies.
That's all right, mate.
Well, just on the point that, you know, if we can't contextualise as harrowing or as horrific as the situation and how events have unfolded, we can't really learn and take heed of past mistakes or past atrocities. So, you know, I used to be a lecturer on Middle East politics. I used to teach the Israel-Palestine dilemma, as I'd call it. I think it's a bit skewed to call it a conflict. So I used to teach my students, for example, if you aren't able to contextualise, for example, the rampant anti-Semitism that took place on the continent in Europe, you can only then gain an appreciation for why there was a need for this notion of Jewish self-determination.
Yes.
And then how an ideology like Zionism gains traction. Benevolent intentioned or not, that's another debate. But ultimately, just coming to today with regards to reaction and whatnot, there's two issues at play. One, ultimately, and I think your last caller actually alluded to it, is that if we are looking, if we are genuinely serious about de-escalating and you know, beyond the more understandably emotive and sometimes knee-jerk reactions, which could, of course, exacerbate the problem, is ultimately, you know, compliance with international law, and that squarely lays ending Israeli impunity. I mean, impunity is really the key word here.
What does punishment look like?
Punishment?
For breaches of international law or for breaches of UN resolutions. What would you like the world to do?
Well, we were able to. I mean, if Amnesty International is now regarding Israel as an apartheid state, I think the most analogous example would be
that's
how
not
the international
international law. I'm not having an argument with you. I'm just steering you away from charities and back to international law and institutions.
Well, with regards to if it is recognised that Israel in this context is committing several international war crimes in this respect and crimes against humanity, which the practice of apartheid is.
Well, hang on.
It was only through ending South Africa's impunity were we able to hold them to account and end apartheid in that country. But for
you mean
reason,
through sanctions?
There's something.
You mean through sanctions? Listen, I need to pin down what you're saying, Hassan. Do you mean through sanctions?
Yeah, through sanctions, through the cultural boycott, the very thing that people, you know, the activists who've been calling for has been, you know, through BDS, for example, has been regarded as somehow discriminatory. But it's, you know, it's a form of it's not through non-violent means.
Well, it's a form It's a form of non-military collective punishment. Well,
that's how apartheid South Africa came to an end.
That's a very arguable position. But let's pretend it's completely copper bottomed. It doesn't change the fact that you are advocating for non-military collective punishment.
I'm not, for one, I mean, having taught Middle East politics, I'm not one, I don't take any glee from utilising sanctions.
No, it's not a trick question. It just, that is what you're calling for. And of course, it depends upon... It depends upon... Okay, I mean... I thought this might happen. And it was very good of you to establish at the start that you weren't really contributing to any of the conversations that we're having today. But let me try and steer you briefly because we're short of time. How would imposing sanctions on Israel help people in Gaza?
Because it would. Because what other way when you've got an Israeli cabinet?
No, that's a question. That's a question. I do need an answer.
Yeah. I'm going to answer the question. The point is that, well, what other solution have we got?
That's a question.
How do we? Well,
that's another question.
I'm answering it through a rhetorical question.
Well, I don't want to rhetorical. I want to know how it will help the people in Gaza.
It'll help the people in Gaza because we need some way of holding Israel to account.
But how will it help the people in Gaza?
Because it may deter Israel from maintaining occupation and the besiegement of a people that are illegally occupied. Which comes on to my other point.
So no, hang on. Let's examine that properly. Let's unpack that. So putting sanctions on Israel with reference to Gaza would make them do what exactly? Bring down the wall?
Well, it may actually create some form of pressure on Israel's part to actually revise and have a realistic approach to coming towards not a two-state solution, which I believe is dead and buried, which, but a one-state reality.
I am out of time, and I don't want you to feel unfairly hurried, but I just want you to put into words precisely what you think and may or might happen in the context of the blockade between Israel and Gaza. Sanctions upon Israel would prompt Israel to take down this blockade. Is that what you're saying? I'm genuinely confused.
I'm just saying there needs to be some form of political pressure internationally.
Yes, but that's not an answer to
sanctions.
the question of how it would help the people. You can say, well, it wouldn't help the people of Gaza at all, but it would make me feel better.
It's not, but helping the people. Maintaining the status quo isn't helping the people of Gaza.
No, which is why I'm asking how your proposal to change the status quo would.
Because Israel feels emboldened because it has impunity on the international stage.
Yes,
so it's going to level Gaza to the ground.
But the sanctions in terms of helping the people of Gaza, maybe I've gone down a rabbit hole, Hassan.
Well,
I'm not sure.
But look, didn't international pressure end apartheid rule in South Africa or not? Was there nothing
international pressure did, and I've allowed your use of the word apartheid and indeed your mention of Amnesty International using it too, but it's far from established with the same certainty that it was in South Africa in apartheid.
On the contrary, I mean, you've got people like Desmond Tutu who say that the situation in Israel-Palestine is even worse than South Africa.
Yes, exactly. But in Israel, you don't have people who are as clear about this description as you are and Desmond Tutu is. So I'm not necessarily rejecting your use of language. I'm just pointing out that it's the difference between an opinion and a unanimous recognition, which is what you had in South Africa. Nobody in South Africa denied the existence of apartheid. Millions of people in Israel do.
So do you recognise that the Palestinians are an occupied people? Is that an established fact in your mind?
Well, the Palestinian people were. And also you're jumping around now like a jelly bean. We're having a conversation about how sanctions are going to help the people in Gaza. We're having the conversation about your use of the word apartheid, which I had to correctly challenge and point out that you were being a little bit disingenuous, and that's fine. And now you're having a conversation about what I understand the word occupied to mean. And I don't know where you were even talking about.
Well, where's the start? The starting point?
And how is any of this? And how is any of this relevant to the conversation we're having today about what is likely to happen next?
Because I'm saying the problem at the heart of it, instead of just resorting to emotive knee-jerk responses, is that we need to have compliance with international law. Until that comes into being...
But we're talking about a terrorist attack, mate.
But that's your framing. By international law...
Okay, so you think that was within international law?
By international law, it's the occupied who have the right to self-defense. Israel is the occupier.
So you're now describing the events of this weekend as self-defense?
I'm not saying that.
So why did you bring the phrase into this conversation then?
No, because we keep hearing this mantra that Israel has the right to defend itself.
No, not from me. Again, you're having a conversation independently of what everybody else is talking about. Why did you bring...
I'm saying that's what
we're
Western
talking about the
politics-
events of this weekend, and we're talking about Israel's current and likely response. You've talked a lot about international law, so I merely pointed out that what happened this weekend is categorically in breach of every imaginable law, and yet you started talking about...
Look, as harrowing as it is...
Go on.
The thing is, God, and honestly...
I'm very, very late for the break now. I think I've given you plenty of time, but go on, just give me a sentence on why...
But occupied people, by international law, have the right to self-defend
But
themselves.
why have you mentioned that? Why have you mentioned that in the context of this weekend?
In the context... Well, you're wanting to understand why such atrocities happen, don't you?
You phoned in to talk about my opening to yesterday's programme. Today's show is entirely about Israel's response to the terrorist attack, and I don't understand why you've used the word self-defence phrase.
No, because the problem, James, is you want to speak about such events in a vacuum.
No, I want you to tell me why you've talked about self-defence in the context of the last 48 hours, the last 72 hours. That's all.
So Gaza has not been besieged. You're
doing it again. It's a very, very simple question. Why is self-defence? Why does that phrase have any place in the conversations that I've had now for 2 days on this programme?
Because I'm just bringing up the notion of international law. That's what
No, you're not. You're bringing up the notion of self-defence. Don't insult my listeners. They've been listening to this conversation. Why have you brought self-defence into this conversation?
Because occupied people have the right to resist using whatever.
But we're talking about
means.
Okay, so you think the terrorist attacks this weekend were acts of self-defence? Then why didn't you just say so?
No, I'm saying.
We're going around in circles now. I'm sorry, Hassan. I've given you every opportunity to explain why you're using the words that you're using, and you're refusing to pay me the courtesy of responding honestly.
No,
why have you mentioned self-defence in the context of what happened over the last 3 days?
Because we're given this assumption, this tacit understanding.
Please just answer my question, please.
I am answering.
Are you describing these actions as self-defence? And if you're not, why bring the words into the conversation?
I'm saying that any occupied people have the right to respond.
I think I understand why you're doing that, and I hope you do too. It's 11:23 now. It's 11:26 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Actually, glancing at the clock, I'll go straight to the phones because we won't have long before the news. Rosie is in Borehamwood. Rosie, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. Firstly, I want to thank you for your impartiality and journalistic integrity. I know this is a very difficult debate to be having. I was very nervous to call in. I'm a mess, to be honest. Haven't slept for 3 days. My daughter is currently a combat soldier serving in the IDF. And as I was sitting wondering whether to call you or not, I received a text from her to say they'd found the body of her friend. That last night she was messaging me in the hope that they were going to find her.
Her friend had been kidnapped, had she, or they just didn't know where she was?
I'm not sure the details.
I'm sorry. And is she a comrade of your daughter, or just like a social friend, a friend? Okay.
Yeah, my daughter was
I'm sorry for your loss.
That party.
Yes.
Thank you. So as you can imagine, it's very close to us. Something that I've been shouting at the radio for the last few days, in fact for the last 20 years. I want to tell you some of the stories that I can tell you of what my daughter tells me. First of all, she serves in the IDF, and she serves with Muslims. She serves with Druze, and she serves with Christians. This is not a fight of Jew against Muslim. This is a fight against right against wrong. I also want to tell you that when she has to guard Palestinian villages, many Palestinians come to her begging for her help. They are terrified of their own police. They are terrified of the corruption. And as an Israeli that lived there for 17 years, I can tell you that the only solution I see to the long-term problem is that the Palestinians get leadership that can lead them in the right direction. The corruption.
But what do you think the right direction is? Because, without a formalised state, what would they be leading?
I would love them to have their own state. I think they could have a wonderful life if they lived as neighbours of Israel. It's a very successful country. And as our other neighbours have, Jordan, Egypt, we could live in peace together. I promise you, I'm a settler. I'll tell everybody that. I lived on the settlements for 17 years. We call them disputed territories, and it's not the time to get into the politics of
Well, I
that.
don't know that that's fair, actually, after, I was pretty robust with Hassan over his use of the word apartheid, so I think I have to be robust with you over your euphemistic description of occupied territories.
Okay, we can have that discussion. It's a long one to have.
Well, again, I can't. I mean, you were very kind in your compliment of my impartiality at the outset. So,
fair.
I can't go after Hassan for using the word apartheid with less alacrity than I go after you for misrepresenting the occupied territories, Rosie.
That's fair. This discussion is had all over Israel every day between left and right.
Of course,
everyone
but just for the record, I don't accept your use of those words any more than I accept his.
If you want to meet me and have that debate when we've got hours to talk about it, because it takes hours, I would be happy to do that. And I respect your opinion. I respect the opinions of many people that will.
What do you think is going to happen next? And given that you have your daughter where she is now, I almost hesitate to ask that question.
We're terrified, and I'm terrified for the innocent Palestinians, and I'm terrified for the Israelis. I have family and friends all over the country, as you can imagine. I have young lads and lasses that are waiting on the borders of Gaza that are fighting now. My daughter is there. She's a girl, a very brave one, but she's out there fighting, and we are terrified of the escalation, like the whole world. And we just want peace. As a settler, whether you agree whether it's a settler or a disputed or occupied or whatever, that label.
It's not that glib, though, is it? Come on, Rosie. I can't let you just gloss over it like that. But you're right.
Well,
we can do that. We can do that another time because we're short of time.
We haven't got time. I'm saying not because
how
it's
much?
not important. I can tell you that. I just want to say that living in the settlements for 17 years. Occupied territories, if you want to call them that, that's what that label is.
That's what they are.
Oh, well, I disagree, but like I say, there's not time for that conversation.
Okay.
What I want to say to you is I can tell you from first-hand experience that most of the people that were my friends and neighbours want peace, desperately want peace.
But
and I'm sure many of the Palestinians want peace.
Of course they do, but it's astonishing that you and Hassan have come on next to each other because he would see. He would see. Yes, no, hang on. Just he would see your presence in those territories as a provocation, which entitles people to undertake acts of self-defense. And you're both quite intractable. Both civilized, educated, intelligent, charming people, but utterly, utterly intractable and quite possibly incapable of seeing how you are yin to each other's yang.
No, it's not impossible for me to see that at all. I would be happy we would give up land. I would be happy to move. We did it in Gaza. We moved every single Israeli person that was called a settlement out for peace. And for peace, I would leave my home overnight. I'm not there anymore. I left a few years ago.
All right. And can I ask you one? Okay. No, I respect that. And if the dog could see the rabbit, so to speak, if you could see that the action would have the consequence that you desired. But I would like to ask you one thing from a personal perspective, and that is your current attitude towards the current Israeli government and its role in what's happened in the last few days.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
Very difficult to answer very quickly.
Okay, you don't have to.
It's difficult to put into words. I'm hoping, I'm praying that we do the right thing, and the right thing for me is to get rid of this barbaric thing that has been an obstruction to peace for so many years. This has not happened overnight. And I just ask one more thing of people. When you talk about Israel, first of all, avoid the propaganda online. There is so much false information out there. And secondly...
there's false information from everywhere. There's lots...
Yeah, I teach that. That's my job, so I know what I'm talking about.
Same here.
And secondly, I would just ask people to look at a map of Israel. It's complex. It's complicated beyond words.
Well, I think everyone, if we can find any areas of unanimous agreement, the idea that it's complicated beyond words would indeed be one of those. But thank you, Rosie. And I say again, those two calls coming in swift succession have demonstrated much more than perhaps either caller allowed or intended or even expected. And that is the position that we find ourselves in. Just language, isn't it? Self-defense, apartheid, occupied. You can't even agree on what words mean. You're never going to agree on anything. Thomas Watts has your headlines. It is 11:37 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Quite a few of you picking up on something I just pointed out. This text puts it well. If ever there was a snapshot of how complex it is to find a solution to the situation in Israel and Palestine, it's the two calls that you have just taken in quick succession. You're right. And, as I say to you on many, many, many occasions, I can only work with what you give me. And thankfully, you generally give me astonishing raw material to work with. Daniel is in Stanmore. Daniel, what would you like to say?
I just wanted to address your point or the question of what happens next. And it's safe to say that the bombardment will continue and the next phase will have to be a ground invasion. Israel has to root out Hamas, and let's call them what they are. They're terrorists. The act on Saturday it's indescribable, and as a Jew in North West London feeling helpless here, it's been an emotional 72 hours for me. But the simple answer is they're going to have to go in and they're going to have to go house to house if they really want to worm out Hamas. Because there's no other way of restoring deterrence by wiping them out. Now, the issue is... But,
deterrents don't work, do they? If the Saturday showed us many, this weekend rather, showed us many things, but deterrents aren't going to work. These people went into Israel knowing they were going to die. How does killing them provide a deterrent?
It doesn't, and if anything, it just raises another generation of Palestinians who are going to hate Israel for resenting Israel. But
these are reasons not to do the things you just told us that Israel needed to do.
But there's no other way of dealing with terrorists.
But you've just said that doing the thing you've called for would create a new generation of terrorists.
And that's the moral dilemma.
It's not a moral dilemma. It's night following day. If you don't want a new generation of terrorists, you're going to have to come up with a different plan from the one you've rung in to endorse.
Well, we've tried that in the past with talking with them, offering peace. We gave them Gaza. Well, we gave them the whole Gaza Strip.
Okay. Which has been described by international observers as the largest open prison in the world.
It's amazing. They can't get electricity, but they can get weapons. What type of prison is that?
Well, it's a prison where you can carry a gun through a tunnel or over a border, but you can't set up an electricity infrastructure.
Okay, so let's look at the root of it then.
Okay.
If Hamas... Okay, actually, I was thinking about this yesterday, okay?
Yeah.
If we want to call them freedom fighters...
No one's done that today.
No, I know. No, but I'm
saying... So let's have a conversation about stuff that we're talking about, not about completely disconnected phenomena.
Okay, let's keep it real then. If Hamas really cared about the Palestinians, they would put their arms down and say, okay, let's work towards a peace. And you've got the area of Gaza, you can self-govern there. If you work with the Israelis, they have been in the past providing...
Well, I mean, you know as well as I do that they were democratically elected to govern in, I think, 2006, and it was rejected. Yeah. It was rejected by the international community and I think by Israel as well.
Well, regardless if it was rejected or not, they are the leaders.
But that's the precedent that they would follow, isn't it? I mean, I'd go, crikey, don't put me in a position of trying to imagine what goes on in their heads. But what you've just suggested as a course is a course that had already been closed to them. And I have to pick up on the notion of we gave them Gaza because, you know, the 1948 settlements or people removed from their ancestral homes. And I, if I were one of them, it wouldn't sound like generosity and largesse to me, Daniel, to say, oh, you can have that bit there and we'll pack you all in there, but you definitely can't have your ancestral home back. So, you know...
And that point there just shows how complex.
Yes, exactly, which is why perhaps ringing in to say we've got to go in and start going door to door and killing people is not going to be a solution to anything. But I think, and listen, this isn't a criticism at all, but you began by talking about your own emotional situation. Mm-hmm. I think it might make you feel better if that happened.
It's a good way of phrasing it, but I was answering a question in terms of what is next, and that is honestly what is going to have to happen next. Whether the outcome is positive or negative.
Because
It's
yes, but
safe to
that's
say
why
it's
I'm bringing
gonna
your
be
emotions into it, because you
Yeah.
think that has to happen next, because that will
Okay.
that will
Taking my
satisfy
emotions
your.
out of it.
Well, I can't. Well, I will if
No,
you
no,
want,
no,
but you
I'm
did
taking it
bring
out
them.
now.
You did bring them into it.
No, I agree. I'm going to take my emotions out of it. What I would want to happen from a neutral perspective
Yeah.
is Israel to have them in a position where we have to sit down and talk this through in terms of Hamas mediated by Egypt, a conversation about how they can advance peace. And they've done this in the past, after operations, the countless operations in the past. Now, obviously, we have to think about this is not an operation. This is obviously a war.
But also, anything
most
you
people
point as happening in the past, it kind of, with the fact that we're having this conversation now, is kind of proof that it didn't work, isn't it?
I know.
It's crazy.
But I think it comes down to the point of, if the Palestinians put down their weapons, there'll be peace. If Israel don't put down the weapons, there'll be no Israel. And that is
Yes,
a simple
I've already made that point, and I do understand it. But it's much easier to say from the perspective of the current status quo if you're Israeli as opposed to Palestinian, isn't it?
No, of course.
That's the problem. I mean, and actually, one point we never make, and again, it's a little bit simplistic, but a genuinely impartial, independent observer, do you think they would rather be Palestinian living in Gaza or Israeli living in Israel?
Well, the latter.
Yeah, and yet a lot of these conversations are framed as if it were the other way round.
For an Israeli living in Gaza.
No, sorry, Matt, I should have been clearer. It's as if, as if the threat and the peril that people in Israel live under is comparable to the threat and the peril that people in Gaza live under. When I mean, statistically, it isn't really.
No, if you look at the numbers, then they're skewed, obviously, in the favour of Israelis in terms of less Israelis being killed. That's another conversation in terms of bomb shelters and Iron Dome. But again, it just shows the complexity of it all.
It does.
But at the end of the day, if Hamas turn around now and say, OK, Israel, let's stop and have... Oh, no, that's even stupid because Israel aren't going to turn around and go, OK, fine, you've killed 1,000 of us. We're going to sit down.
You've got that right.
Yeah. It's a rock and a hard place for neutrals, but also Palestinians and Israelis saying this, saying that. I think the status quo just suits or benefits.
Well, it keeps Netanyahu in power, and it keeps Hamas leaders in power as well. And that in some, I mean, the ugliest conclusion to draw sometimes, as you I think were just alluding to, is that the status quo might be horrible, but other people with different motivations may consider it to be the least bad of options, without some massive change in position that neither side is prepared to even contemplate. Daniel, thank you for that. I appreciate your personal perspective on it, and I appreciate your honesty. I really do. But I think what we both discovered during the course of that conversation is that you might have an urge, an atavistic or an emotional urge for much more robust action in Gaza, but it wouldn't actually achieve anything. Certainly not in the long term, and probably not in the short term. And of course, if people are prepared to die, as I think almost everyone that went over the border from Gaza into Israel at the weekend was, then tracking people down and killing them is going to be an odd sort of deterrent. It's 11:45. It is 11:48, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we've had a fruitful conversation, an interesting conversation, a fraught and difficult conversation, and I'm sure I haven't got everything right in every minute of it, but it's better for having been had, and yet, as I said to you at 10 o'clock yesterday morning, we won't make any progress, and we won't really come to a better understanding of why it feels as if more bloodshed will have to happen. And there it is. That's, man hands on misery to man. It deepens like the coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can and don't have any kids yourself, as Philip Larkin wrote. 11:49 is the time. Zara is in Leicester. Zara, what would you like to say?
Hi. Well, I've got so much to say. But first of all, I want to just say that I'm really, really sorry that because of the way that people have behaved and the way that the Jewish people are feeling and they're scared. Equally, I want to just say that Muslim people are feeling equally scared. For example, yesterday I had to go somewhere and I didn't take the train or public transport because I've seen the hateful comments online from people, especially the far right, who are really sort of exploiting the situation.
Yes.
And it's emboldened them. So I'm also equally fearful, and I therefore paid almost £400 to get to the work event that I needed to get to and back yesterday out of my own fee, because I was scared. So I just wanted to say that. But
it's an important point. Anyone who's even glanced at social media will understand exactly where you're coming from.
The far right, absolutely. I mean, they're blaming it on Muslims. It's Islamic culture. It's how they're born.
It's not just the far right. Well, actually, possibly it is the far right, but it fits with the rhetoric of the current Home Secretary as well, of course, when talking
and her,
about...
of course, and her. But what I wanted to talk about was dignity. And the problem is that when you dehumanise people and you don't give them their dignity, this is what they become. Now, most people may not have seen the things that happen in Palestine. I've seen video footage regularly over the past few years, even just 2 weeks ago, of the kind of things that the IDF do in Palestine. And it is equally the same as the way that Hamas behaved in Israel this weekend. Absolutely deplorable and disgusting. 2 weeks ago...
I'm going to push back against the use of the word equally, I think. Equally deplorable,
disgusting was what I'm saying.
Possibly, but just in terms of quantity of carnage as opposed to anything else.
I'm not talking about carnage, I'm talking about
let me explain where I'm coming from.
Okay,
so because you use the word equally, right?
Okay.
And that immediately suggests that what is visited upon Palestinian people is equal to what was visited upon...
I don't mean it like that, and you know that.
I don't know that. I'm giving you the opportunity to clarify, because a lot of people listening will have heard the word equally and thought that you were doing equivalent.
Okay, let me clarify. What I mean to say is, like 2 weeks ago, the IDF went into a few houses in a neighbourhood, and they forced the women to strip at gunpoint in front of their children, absolutely stripped naked, and made them walk around in a circle. They were crying, begging them not to make them do that in front of their children, older children, boys, husbands, male men in the family. That's just one of the examples of the dignity that, is taken away from Palestinians. And so, of course, you're going to have a generation that grows up with hate and retaliation and behaves the way that Hamas and the men that went into Israel behaved. Which is obviously disgusting.
Yes.
I'm not
not to contradict you, but just for the benefit of people less informed than you, it was female soldiers, female Israeli Defence Force.
Was it female? Okay, right.
Well, you should probably know that before you drop it into the middle of my radio show.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, but still, to do that to anyone...
absolutely, but it changes the picture enormously, doesn't it, for people listening?
Yeah, but it's the way... This is how terrorists are grown. This is how terrorists are basically raised. And I think the only solution is Netanyahu has been, in his post for a long time. He needs to be removed. The international community, as some of the callers said, they need to step in and they need to remove Netanyahu.
I'm losing your phone line. If you could stand still and just...
sorry, I'm outside in a car park.
That's all right.
So we need to... I think the international community needs to step in and say, look, everything that you've done so far has not worked. We need to bring in new leadership, both in Palestine, I know they've tried that before, and in Israel. We need to remove Netanyahu.
Well, that's a democratic. That's a question of elections, isn't it? Really?
No, as in, not even elections. Literally forced. Bring someone in. Two sides stepped in to have a negotiation. Really, really talk about, settlements. Talk about releasing their prisoners, because Hamas made it very clear, didn't they, that they have taken these people hostage because they want to negotiate their prisoners. They want to have their female prisoners released, because the IDF have been imprisoning children and women for years, indiscriminately, and they want those people released. Now, you see that they've used the wrong tactic.
Well, I haven't seen that yet myself, actually, from Hamas.
I did, yeah. I saw that somewhere. I can't remember where, but basically they have said... it was in Arabic, but they basically said that they wanted to have their female...
Because I've seen them say that they'll execute one on live television for every bomb that drops on Gaza.
That was yesterday, but the day before that was the female prisoner thing.
Okay.
But yes, I also saw that. But yeah, so I think the key is literally we need new leadership on both sides, enforced by the international community, zero support and arms sent to Israel, and really just and sort of pacifying in a way and saying, look, we're bringing a new leadership to the table. Hamas, step back. Let's talk about this.
But I can't fault that bit of what you've said, but I think it's pie in the sky, isn't it? I think we probably both know that. But the idea... I don't know, though. Yeah, you need to create a scenario in which peace is an achievable goal, and yet there will be people in both Gaza and Israel who don't think that peace is an achievable goal until their enemy is vanquished completely, and that is almost certainly a logistical and a physical impossibility. And on we go, and on we go, and on we go.
Yeah, you're right. But I think the current situation is not. It's going to be ongoing. It's going to breed more resentment, more hate. More freedom fighters or terrorists, whatever you want to call them. It is not going to end.
Yeah.
This is not the way.
I mean, in the context of this weekend, I will call them terrorists. Thank you.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, I mean, the way they behaved was absolutely, and I'd just like to say, un-Islamic. It's disgusting, and it's a shame. They brought shame to the religion. And I know the people that are celebrating, the majority of Muslims that are celebrating Bradford, Birmingham, wherever you've seen them, London, I don't think, personally, I don't know them, but I don't think they're celebrating the way that they treated the civilians. I think they're celebrating that they finally got power, they finally showed strength. I think that's what they're celebrating, that they've got a chance of, I think that's what most people are thinking, not the specific details of what they did. And when you look at what they did, it is absolutely shameful, honestly. And I mean, it's not the way that you're taught. You can't celebrate anybody being,
no, and yet
women and children and elderly, which we're told is one of our laws. You can't target them. It's one of our laws of war. The Prophet Muhammad told us this, and they know this. So, and I also really question the people that went in and the people that got in with all that surveillance. How the hell did they get in?
Well, that is the question that is going to be.
I'm wondering, are they really who are they?
Yeah.
I don't know who they are.
Don't go conspiracy. I thought you were going to go conspiracy theory on me there, Zara, for a minute. Don't go conspiracy theory on me.
No, I'm not, but I'm wondering who they are.
Well, I mean, the organisational requirements that must have been in place, and in fact, as the days pass, I've seen some reports that there would have been quite senior Hamas people who had little idea about what was going to happen. I think it was Oz Chatterjee who's provided us with some astonishing reports from Kyiv and follows these events very, very closely. Is posting some fascinating, developing stories. But yes, I mean, that will be when I don't want to say when the dust settles because that sounds glib, but the question, as we began at 10 o'clock this morning by saying that it will be the subject of inquiries and soul-searching for years to come, how Hamas managed to launch a brutal terrorist offensive without any foreknowledge, apparently, inside Israel's formidable intelligence services. Thank you, Zara. I mean, I often think it's ridiculous to ask people to confine their contributions to the time available. Rarely will it ever be more ridiculous than this, Jamie, in Glasgow. But I've got 2 minutes and you're welcome to as much of them as you want.
Thank you. So I'm actually an international law and security master's student. And under my kind of studies, I understand that I don't think there has been anything formally agreed, but as per Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and under the Hague 1907 Convention, Article 42 and Article 49 of the Geneva Convention, I would argue that Palestine has been placed under an occupation by the Israeli state.
When geographically, when you use the word Palestine, what are you referring to?
So I'm referring to the Palestinian kind of states that were agreed through the UN, through the two-state party. For people not clear on what that means, what does that mean? Where precisely? So the two-party states, so it's the West Bank and the upper east side of the sort of landmass between the two. I think it was kind of described as a sort of X in a way by the UN. That land has been encroached on since then. Under the Hague Convention of 1907, the territory can be considered as under occupation when it's actually placed under the authority of a hostile army. Now, we saw throughout 2017 and 2018, Palestinian people who have work permits to work outside of the occupied area that they are placed in have died because they're placed in cages to try and exit. Palestinian people who have work permits to work outside of this area sleep at their work so that they don't have to go through these measures. We also saw in 2018 that Palestinian people tried to negotiate peacefully
for an end to the occupation and for peace talks, but thousands were killed. I think this is something that will obviously need to be negotiated internationally, and I think as well states outside of Israel and Palestine need to look at their own historical context.
Okay, instance, I did warn you that we only had 2 minutes, so I can only apologise, and also, you know, a friendly reminder that we do ask fairly specific questions for reasons, for good reason on the programme, largely because there is so much extraneous information and so many other issues that might be pertinent to the central question. But if we focus on the central question, we generally make a little bit more progress. But I'm not disputing or challenging anything that you said, because I don't want to, and B, because I don't have the knowledge that you have, even if I was minded to do so. It's coming up. Well, it's just gone 12 o'clock actually. I think what I'll take away from that was one of the things that happened at the very beginning when you're reading a report from 2014 about the broader ramifications that could frankly have been written today. It is 4 minutes after 12. This is a story that... do you know the maddest thing, perhaps, about the 4 hours of conversation that we've had about the events in Israel over the weekend and the likely aftermath is... I could be wrong, but I don't think anyone's mentioned religion. Have they? I don't think... Well, if we did, it was very briefly alluded to. Just that idea that you have a sort of divine right to pursue whatever course you want to pursue. If that only, but it wasn't. I mean, I don't know that we've done that before. We haven't talked about the Middle East for quite a long time, actually. But when we used to, religion would be central to it, and it reminds me of Ireland. Actually, it reminds me of the Troubles and the discovery, really, at the most cursory study of it, that really, I mean, sectarianism and actual religion are quite different things. I just mentioned that because there is a story today in the Times about non-religious people having a more positive experience of life and enjoying stronger social networks than those with a deep faith. It's not, I mean, it's by Gallup, which is a reputable polling firm, and there are two things about this that I find absolutely fascinating. Some of the questions, I'll tell you what they are in a minute. I'll open up the phone lines. Some of the questions include, did you smile or laugh a lot yesterday? Did you learn or do something interesting yesterday? I think we're probably the reason. I think we've skewed the research. I think if you listen to this program, then you'll go, regardless of what your religious affiliations might be, then you're going to be answering yes to all of these questions. Did you smile and laugh a lot yesterday? Yes, I did, particularly between 10 o'clock in the morning and 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, next question. Did you learn or do something interesting yesterday? Yes, I did, particularly between 10 o'clock in the morning and 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So there are two interesting things about this, and I'm not sure you're going to believe the second bit. The first bit is that in the UK, non-religious people apparently have a more positive experience of life and enjoy stronger social networks than those with a deep faith. The second bit is, in the rest of the world, it's the other way round. So there are two killer questions here for you. Why do you think non-religious people are happier than people with a deep faith? And then the second question becomes, which I don't think you can answer from a position of personal experience. The second question becomes, why is the United Kingdom the outlier? This is Brexit. This is exceptionalism. This is a apparent evidence that we are, in some deep and meaningful way, different from everybody else. So that's it. I just want you to reflect on this, and I need your help because we've been in very deep territory for the last 2 hours, and this is, I hope, a slightly lighter conversation, although you don't often say that about religious issues. So you don't need any particular grounding or understanding of the issues to answer the question of why you think non-religious people have a more positive experience of life and stronger social networks than people with deep faith, which flies in the face of what my presumptions were. And yet, when I think about my own life, I wonder whether I kind of have some evidence of it. I don't know. I've had a very religious upbringing. That probably did more harm than good, but that was to do with priests, not with religion itself. That was to do with men who really weren't worthy of the office that they held or the influence that they had over my life. But I always derived enormous amounts of solace from church, specifically from church. And that just comes and goes throughout my life. When I lost my dad in 2012, I found myself going to church a lot. We were already attending, but that was like the place I'd go to talk to him. So in the immediate aftermath of grief, religion made me happier. But then when I look back on my teenage years and the sort of moral instruction of the Catholic Church, putting me in a state of sinfulness on various occasions, it just added to my stresses. So when I'm going through periods of faith, am I happier or less happy than when I'm going through periods of little or no faith? I couldn't tell you, actually. I couldn't tell you. But I want you to tell me why you think non-religious people have a more positive experience of life and enjoy stronger social networks than those with a deep faith. Ideally, I mean, from a position of personal perspective. So you used to have a position of deep faith, and now you don't. Why do you think you're happier now than you were then? 0345 6060973. And for is it sociologist? Yeah, Will's just texted Catholic guilt. You're right. And actually, I must. There was a very, very funny text that I must read out. I think I've probably. Here you go. Apologies to Ian. He says it's bad enough that you ignore all my texts, but saying that nobody mentioned religion, you're trolling me now. So presumably Ian sent me a lot of texts mentioning religion in the context of the conversation we've had over the last 4 hours, or rather 4 hours over the last 2 days. So I thought I'd read your text out just to prove you wrong on that one, Ian. So that's double trolling now. You can't accuse me of not reading your text out when I'm literally in the process of reading your text out. So if you've had deep faith in your life and you don't now, can you explain why you think you are happier now than you were then? 0345 6060973. Does the thought of heaven play a part in it? The thought of an afterlife? I'd have thought that was quite an uplifting belief, but possibly not. And then you've got the judgment that's attached to a lot of religions. You've got an awful lot of a kind of sense of shame and guilt and all that kind of stuff, which if you are an atheist, if you are non-religious, if you don't believe, then you are free from all of that. You are a prisoner only of your conscience, which is generally quite a good thing, because if you haven't got a conscience, you're Boris Johnson. You're a sociopath. There's reasons why mankind created religions, and it is to try and impose order upon chaos, to try and create stability and indeed fealty and loyalty within societies. So I find this fascinating. They're looking at the devout people in most religious countries reporting an average score for positive experiences of 67%, but for non-religious people it goes right down to 58.7%. So how religious a country is becomes part of it, which speaks to the second bit of the question, which is why is the UK an outlier on this? What is it about the United Kingdom in 2023 that means devoutly religious people will be less happy than non-religious people, when in almost all other countries the opposite holds true? That's really interesting. We could have a think about that. I mean, I don't think that publicly religious people do religion itself much favours. You know, the kind of people who claim to be devout Christians while they're either insulting poor people or waxing lyrical about food banks. I'm thinking about conservative politicians, really, who trumpet their Catholicism or their Christianity while punting policies that would have Jesus absolutely apoplectic with disapproval. It would be like the moneylenders in the temple times 10. So that could be part of it. That might be part of it, is why we are becoming a less religious country, because people who claim they are religious are so unimpressive, so deeply unimpressive. But why would that make us happier as non-religious people than we would be as religious people? 13 minutes after 12 is the time. Stefan writes, religion in a multicultural society like the UK keeps people and groups apart. Religion in a mainly single cultural society brings everyone together. I know this from experience growing up in Iceland and then living in the UK. That's really interesting. It could be that we have, the numbers don't necessarily support Stefan's point, but I guess the question of being devoutly religious does. Lots of people who loosely call themselves Christian would not call themselves devoutly religious. So divisions between Christians and Sikhs and Hindus and Jews and Muslims, I don't know. Maybe that is something to do with it. And Stephen on the Isle of Dogs quite rightly points out, I just said religion brings social stability, which is not true really when you look at Jerusalem at the moment and elsewhere. No, you know what I mean. I didn't say now. I meant back in the mists of time, Stephen, when religion... Look, so, for example, King Alfred wouldn't have been able to introduce law, really, to what has become England if it wasn't for religion. If the churches hadn't already imposed some sort of framework of order, then you wouldn't have been able to get common law out there. And even today, our judicial system hinges upon Judeo-Christian traditions. So obviously religion also causes a hell of a lot of problems. Inarguably, I would say more problems than it solves on a global level or a societal level. But the reason why they came into force, or the reason why they spread, the reason why a Roman emperor would have embraced Christianity is that you can combine government with evangelism. You can spread messages under the guise of the church that are of benefit to the state. However, why the UK should be the hotbed of non-religious people being happier than religious people, I do not know, and I can't wait to find out why you think that might be. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The time now is 12:15. The phone lines are open, and the questions for once are pretty clear. 12:17. Why do you think non-religious people are happier than people with deep faith? Wait for it. And why is that only true in the United Kingdom? 0345 6060 973. Bill's in Wandsworth. Bill, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Pleasure to speak to you again.
Well, we'll see.
I had to pull over and answer this. I think that in a modern Western society like the UK, where most of our needs are met, you inquire about some of the things that maybe are accepted at face value. Where I asked your researcher actually which countries are included, and she mentioned some parts of Europe and Asia. And I travel quite a lot to Asia, and you see suffering the difficulties that people in that part of the world are facing in their day-to-day lives. But
yes.
We don't have that at all. We have a sort of sophisticated. I know our needs aren't all met; many of them are. And I think that we inquire and. Again, put my cards on the table. When you start reading about religion, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, really, does it?
Or it makes perfect sense. I mean, it depends on your perspective. But I don't think most people described here as non-religious are going to be intellectual atheists who've read a lot into various faiths. I wonder, and I don't know whether this was your point or not, Bill. Forgive me, but are you? Because I think it was Marx, wasn't it, who described religion as the opiate of the masses, by which I think he meant that the promise of the afterlife makes you put up with all sorts of nonsense in the actual life. And you're saying that, and you're saying, I think you're saying, the better your actual life, the less attractive the promise of the afterlife becomes. So you're going to be less religious if life's okay.
I think there's some truth in that, and also we're fairly cynical in the UK. I think if there's such a thing as a national sort of trait, there is a degree of cynicism and a refusal to take everything at face value, possibly. Where a country like America, which is quite insular in many ways, and I've travelled there a lot as well, they kind of don't ask the same questions that perhaps we ask.
Well, we're generalising a bit, but I take your central point. But it doesn't answer the question. Why would a deeply religious person here in the United Kingdom be less happy than a non-religious person?
Well, because I think as well that as you call me, intellectual atheist, I read too much Christopher Hitchens, cleperson.
Yes. I'm not sure it's possible to read too much Christopher Hitchens.
No, I agree. I think, incredible person. But I think I don't judge others, and I don't fear being judged.
So you think that so they might fear being judged, and that would make them less happy.
Absolutely.
But it usually cuts the other way. So I take it. I mean, I get very personal perspective, which is welcome, and indeed what I asked for. And that idea of because we can't get inside the heads of other people. Why would you have been less happy when you were religious if you'd been on that kind of journey?
I think as Hitchens talks about this golden rule that you treat others as you treat, you want to be treated yourself. I mean, that's the way I would treat people. I would try and be respectful and polite and kind as much as possible in my day-to-day life. So I don't,
Not because you feel you have to, not because you're being instructed to, but because you just want to. There is a difference there. Often when I dived into these sort of issues from a perspective of my own faith, I got quite a lot of people got upset with me for suggesting that religion makes you behave well. And it categorically, as Bill points out quite perfectly, it's a stupid suggestion. It maybe compels people who wouldn't naturally behave well to behave a bit better out of fear of retribution, but that's kind of being good under duress as opposed to doing good for good's sake. So, an act of charity is probably more pure if there's no expectation of reward for the person doing it than it is if you're thinking you're going to get your reward in heaven. Becky's in Kenilworth. Becky, what would you like to say?
Hiya. So I think, so for transparency, I think your producer asked me to mention that I was on a different LBC show yesterday talking about Palestine and Israel. So that's by the by, but I just thought I'd mention it just in case. But yeah, on this issue, I think one of the key things is that community, which is a key aspect of many different faiths, has almost, speaking from my perspective as a Christian who's grown up in the church and seen many different changes, I think that's not necessarily a key part of religion anymore. And I think that might be due to the fact of demographics changing in churches. It's probably having a more aging population. And so with the early church being based on community as part of their faith, I think the two things have become separate. And now non-religious people might find stronger social connections and more and happiness because they're able to find, in an age of greater tolerance, obviously it's not perfect, but greater tolerance for differences, kind of like differences in sexuality, gender identity. There's more tools now online and in different parts of life to find.
So you mean a sense of belonging? You mean a sense of belonging, which we might once have derived from church, and now we don't need to.
Yeah, and speaking as someone who's kind of changed churches over the years according.
Oh, an act of God there. So an intervention, a divine intervention to prevent Becky from completing that contribution to the programme. We may never know what it was going to be. 23 minutes after 12. What do you think the time limit is on that? Because you can tell, can't you, when a line's gone? The worst thing is if someone is breathing in or pausing naturally and the line goes down then, that puts me in a very tricky situation. I sometimes think you could get caught in an eternal vortex. Are you there, Becky?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I mean, that's quite a religious question in itself, isn't it?
Sorry. Yes. So I don't know when I got cut off before, but people might have, like you said, people might have derived a sense of belonging in the church, but due to, say someone who's exploring their gender identity, they might not feel welcome in a church. They'll find other forms of community where they might feel.
I don't know that the examples we're exploring here would provide enough heft statistically to change the overall picture. But I like the way it kind of portrays the UK's position in a positive light. It's because multiculturalism has worked so well that you don't have to be deeply religious, that you are going to be more happy if you're not religious, or it's a possibility. How different is the UK to other countries? Just not just on this question, but looking at the bigger picture of what it means. I quite like this one. I think most religious people are more sad because they think about it all the time. The worms will eat us anyway. And Mike in Birmingham quotes one of my favourite philosophers. He says, as Joey Tribbiani once said, there's no such thing as a selfless good deed. Did he really say that? That sounds a little bit astute. Sophisticated for the great Tribbiani. How are you doing? Tom's in Chelmsford. Tom, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I've got it in front of me, the article. It seems the methodology is a bit suspect. I mean,
it's a radio phone-in show, mate. You can't ring in and start questioning the methodology.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, I'll just say this. Did you smile or laugh a lot yesterday?
Yes.
Well, that's all relative, isn't it? Smiling or laugh a lot for me might be a lot less than it is for you, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's really very subjective question.
So we're cracking on with questioning the methodology then? Despite
no, but I'll move on to that.
No, we're in now. You can't be, let's do it. Let's question the methodology.
Measuring what's called Positive Experience Index.
Did you learn or do something interesting yesterday? So you might say yes, and I might say no, but actually yesterday we both did exactly the same things.
Exactly, James.
Yeah.
You've struck the nail on the head there.
Well, I have only because you handed me a hammer, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you
very
much.
But isn't that not true of all kind of well-being surveys? Wouldn't it?
Yes. Well, no. Well, it can all shed a bit of light. I mean, it's got us talking, hasn't it?
No, well, that's why I sort of alluded to the context of a radio phone.
In terms of Britain, some say that we're a more secular society than any other.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned multiculturalism. Maybe it goes a little bit before that to do with, like, a lot of people abandoned the Church of England in terms of going every week, maybe 150 years ago or whatever, but still got their kids baptised. I wasn't, but I mean, I'm still very much within that tradition.
Right.
But I mean, I remember, I'll just say in terms of a personal experience that surprised me, I remember I was having driving lessons, and my driving instructor, he just said, we just need to nip to the church, because he had to, like, turn off the burglar alarm or something. I can't even remember, but I could tell before even mentioning that he was part of the Church of England, and this is in England.
Yeah,
he was like he hesitated to even mention it to me, and he sort of bristled because he was almost expecting from me, like a young person,
mockery.
Which wasn't,
that's
which
interesting.
Is not, which is he was.
Which probably wouldn't happen in other countries because even with your reservations about the methodology, the question of why the UK would respond so differently from almost everywhere else would still be pertinent, wouldn't it? It would still be interesting because the methodology would be the same everywhere. So that could be part. When did that happen then?
About 10.
No, not the driving lesson. The kind of that's my fault entirely. That's exactly what I'd have answered if this conversation was the other way around. But I meant more the depiction. I tell you what, we could blame, Tom. We could blame Monty Python.
Yeah, well, I guess that was a symptom. I mean,
was it a symptom or was it a cause? When did that fear of mockery for being religious take hold in this country in a way that it perhaps hasn't taken hold in other countries?
Well, at the drop-off in religion, I mean, according to someone that did a later life adult degree in history and did a dissertation in precisely this, that claims to be an Anglican Christian but didn't have anything to do with the Anglican Church. And she said, she works in bookshop, and she said that it was actually to do with, it wasn't to do, a lot of people, there's a narrative it's to do with, like, the rise of science and, like, evolution.
But that's not unique to us, is it? That wouldn't explain the UK's. I mean, you're talking about the Enlightenment, essentially. You're talking about 19th century continental philosophy and the sort of attempts of philosophers like Immanuel Kant to replace religion with categorical imperatives and philosophical rationales for behaving altruistically and decently without recourse to a god, to a deity. John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, and similar territory with utilitarianism. But that's, I mean, and Kant was German, Mill and Bentham were Scottish, so it's not. It doesn't explain why the UK would be different. But that, I tell you what might. What might is that notion of mockery. Is the United Kingdom, and I don't have fingers in enough pies to answer this question from a position of knowledge or experience, but is the United Kingdom a place where you are more likely to face mockery or criticism when you state that you're devoutly religious than you are almost anywhere else in the world? That's an interesting, because then, of course, the notion of unhappiness going along with devout religion comes into a completely different light. So I don't know. Who could answer that question? Someone who is devoutly religious and has lived in lots of different places, but it's only in the UK that you feel people are smirking or sniggering when you talk about your faith. 12:30 is the time. Lottie Morley is here with your headlines. 33 minutes after 12 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. this would be part of it from Jed. Being brought up in a strict Catholic school, I became happier when I lost my faith aged 16 and realised I wouldn't be going to eternal hell when I died. That's got to cheer you up, hasn't it? You know, you wake up one morning and think, oh no, I'm going to go to eternal hell when I die. Eternal damnation. And then the next day you wake up, you've lost your faith, and you think, God, that's great. I'm not going to be damned for all time in hell. But it doesn't explain. Well, was a devoutly religious person, Jed, would have believed in eternal damnation, but lived a life that allowed them to avoid it. So I don't know how pertinent your particular experience is to the broader question. 12:34 is the time. The Labour Party conference in Liverpool has got underway in stark contrast to the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, where halls were empty and speeches were weird. Stand up and fight. David Lammy played a blinder yesterday, and it is Yvette Cooper's turn today to Rachel Reeves, extremely well received. Another little example of that. The Daily Mail claimed that Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who endorsed Rachel Reeves' economics plans and called her a serious economist, the Daily Mail was having kittens today because apparently this shattered a well-established convention that Bank of England governors, former Bank of England governors, never get involved in politics. And that's the same Daily Mail to which the former Bank of England Governor Mervyn King regularly contributes political, or at least political-ish, articles. Funny that. I'm sure it's just a sort of a slight oversight on the editorial floor rather than yet more examples of weapons-grade hypocrisy, disingenuousness and dishonesty. But as I say, Yvette Cooper has been on stage today and Henry Riley had a ringside seat. Henry, what did you make of it all?
Yes, good afternoon, James. It was a pretty packed conference hall for Yvette Cooper's speech this morning. There was a huge presence from Labour members, a huge presence from journalists as well, eager to find out exactly what the Shadow Home Secretary, if you're to believe the polls, potentially a future Home Secretary, has to say on a whole variety of issues. One of the key things that Yvette Cooper sought to do right from the start, and obviously you get this at a party conference whereby they're putting clear water between themselves and the Conservative Party, was to refer to what she described as Tory chaos in the Home Office.
So from Labour this week, you get serious plans to change our country. From the Tories last week, what were they on? I mean, the chaos just keeps getting worse. We have had 5 Tory Prime Ministers in 7 years, and 7 Tory Home Secretaries, 2 of them, Suella Braverman, literally the only person who could make you want to bring back Priti Patel. And conference. A Home Secretary more interested in going after Elton John than going after criminals? Well, I guess that's why they call them the Blues.
Yvette Cooper there speaking, and it got a few nods when she said that, you know, rather Priti Patel than Suella Braverman when you see some of what Suella Braverman's done, which was quite surprising. You wouldn't have thought that a couple of years ago when Priti Patel was the Home Secretary. In terms of other issues, violence against women and girls was a key thing that Yvette Cooper spoke about. She said that she wants domestic abuse experts in 999 call centres. She also pledged that actually there should be essentially domestic abuse experts and rape experts at various police forces as well, saying that far too often that is not the case and that is failing women and girls. She also referenced Suella Braverman again later on, saying we've had more Home Secretaries sent to Rwanda than anyone else. But in terms of that policing against violence against women and girls, Yvette Cooper keen to stress that rather than rhetoric, she had 3 concrete policies.
So, conference, the next Labour government will put specialist rape investigation units in every force, domestic abuse experts in every 999 call centre. We will require police forces to use tactics normally reserved for organised crime or terrorist investigations to identify and go after the most dangerous repeat abusers and rapists and get them off our streets.
And that alludes to one of Labour's 5 missions that Sir Keir Starmer set out at the start of the year. Safe streets, stronger policing is one of those, so a bit more meat on the bone when it comes to that. Also, perhaps not surprisingly, Yvette Cooper evoked Tony Blair at one point, saying that we need to be tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, which again got a rapturous applause amongst the delegates at the conference hall.
So an ebullient atmosphere, I think.
Yeah, I mean, right, you can probably hear there is a huge queue from the conference centre that's snaked all the way past the LBC Global stand. It is huge. And again, when I was there this morning, Emily Thornberry kicked things off at the main stand at 9:50. And there were people there who I was asking what they were looking forward to hearing Emily Thornberry talk about. And they said, oh no, we're reserving our seats for Keir Starmer. One person said it's like when you're on holiday and you put your beach towels on a deck chair to try and reserve it for the day. So they even though Keir Starmer doesn't start speaking until 2 o'clock, people there ready to go and sort of getting in. But the slight blow to them was they've been told they have to do a police sweep before the actual speech, and so they've all been kicked out of their seats that they thought they had reserved for Sir Keir Starmer's speech. So they're back in the queue, but they're pretty high up the queue, and I sense they're determined to get themselves a seat.
And how much pressure is on him? I mean, he's a very different situation from Rishi Sunak. They're sort of going into conference on a winning streak as opposed to a long record of losses or draws. So he's not expected to pull anything out of his hat today. But delegates would expect to see a substantive speech as well as a competent one.
Yeah, and I think, look, Sir Keir Starmer's very clear, actually, and he sort of recognises the fact that whilst there is an anti-Conservative sentiment at the moment, if you look at polling, that hasn't necessarily, although, of course, there was the Rutherglen by-election, but it was extremely low turnout, it hasn't actually transformed necessarily into core Labour voters. And so what he needs to do today, yes, he needs to address party delegates who are, of course, looking forward to hearing from their leader, but really, like Rachel Reeves did yesterday, a lot of it's going to be looking down the barrel of the camera, speaking directly to the British people. So in terms of party members, there'll be a lot of policy, but really what he has got to do today is set aside those people who are disillusioned with the Conservatives and make sure they're not wavering. They are definitely going to the Labour Party. And really as well, if you speak to sources close to Sir Keir Starmer, it's the 5 missions that I referenced earlier. There was an acceptance, I have to say, from people within the Labour Party that they haven't necessarily cut through those 5 missions, or that they haven't perhaps played them up enough as they should do. Whatever you think of Rishi Sunak, they're sort of on the tip of people's tongues because he mentions them every answer in an interview. Sir Keir hasn't done that, and so he's going to turn those missions into more sort of policy statements. And I think you'll have a far more tangible goal from Sir Keir Starmer when it comes to growth, when it comes to safer streets, rather than them just being missions. He's going to turn them into policy objectives.
And in terms of tomorrow's front pages, will there be a sort of humdinger of an announcement that nobody is expecting, and that is perhaps in addition to the firming up of the 5 pledges? Humdinger is a technical political term, Henry. I don't know if you've come across it before.
Thank you. I put it in my vocabulary list. But no, I think, look, there was a story reported today about the sort of towns, the new towns that Sir Keir Starmer is very keen to push. That is obviously out there already. If you speak to allies close to Sir Keir Starmer, they will say wait and see. They're being very tight-lipped in terms of what is in the speech. They don't want anything to leak out. So in terms of that humdinger, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait until 2 o'clock, James, but you never know with these speeches. He's going to be speaking for a considerable period of time, perhaps close to an hour. I'm sure there'll be a lot of substance in there that no doubt will make it onto the front pages.
And so we shall watch with interest. I mean, crikey, I've interviewed Keir Starmer. The idea of people queuing around the block is certainly novel, isn't it?
He's rock star here. He's honestly, there are a huge swathe of people waiting to get in. People are already waiting. There's a few screens around the corner as well where some of the other business stands are, and there are people waiting there as well, so they can sort of have their view of the screen unimpeded. So bit of a rock atmosphere here at Labour
bizarre.
Conference.
I mean, there is an air of change in the air, and in fact, I think there's no triumphalism that I've detected, albeit that I'm a few hundred miles away. Triumphalism is not a word I would apply, but boundless optimism. And actually, Rachel Reeves yesterday, David Lammy yesterday, Yvette Cooper, not just looking like a government in waiting, but believing, I think, that they are a government in waiting.
Yes, and I was speaking with Darren Jones this morning, who, to remind your listeners, is the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
He's a very, very impressive politician.
Very impressive. He impressed when he was chair of the Business Committee. And I was asking him this morning, sort of somewhat teasing him, saying, what are we expecting in the speech? Must be looking up for the Labour Party at the moment. And they are they are far from complacent. They really know that the deal is not done. The sort of dotted line has not been signed. They're very clear that actually they realise, what I was saying earlier, really, James, James, that there is this anti-conservative sentiment, but that they haven't necessarily got over the line yet. They don't take these by-elections for granted. There's 2 more key ones coming up, but really Rutherglen they will see as a turning point. But they're not going to stop the messaging. They're not going to stop going out there and, as they would see it, putting out their policies, exposing the Conservatives. And I think that's certainly something Sir Keir Starmer has brought to the party. He's very determined to not be complacent, to really sell the message, and you get the sense he's going to stop at nothing to keep doing that before the next election.
So, Sheila, no doubt taking that live from 2. Henry Riley, many thanks indeed for your sort of pre-match analysis, as it were, and you'll be able to listen to that speech in full, as indeed you could listen to Rishi Sunak's speech in full on this radio station, not this programme. Keir Starmer's speech will be on Sheila's programme. Rishi Sunak's speech was on this programme, but it was so long it actually extended into Sheila's programme. And as we've established earlier today, it didn't need to be that long because a lot of the things he read out weren't actually promises, pledges or policies at all. They were just illustrations. I don't know if you missed that bit of today's show. It's, to me, genuinely staggering that it turns out that long list of things he read out, and we'll build this, and we can build this, and we can build this, and we will build that. Turns out that's not what he was saying at all. He was just saying, no, we can build things like this. There will be a tram from Kidderminster to Timbuktu. So everyone in Kidderminster is going, wow, that's amazing. Everyone in Timbuktu is going, oh, I don't know about that. Have you seen the state of some of those people in Kiddy? But it turns out that was just an illustration of the kind of thing that they could build. 12:45 is the time. It is 12:48 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the conversation has taken a slightly unusual turn. Well, I mean, it hasn't. It's a conversation we intended to have from 12 o'clock, but it's in rather stark and welcome contrast to the gravity of conversations about the Middle East and recent events in Israel. And oddly, given that we spent 4 hours talking about recent events in Israel since the beginning of this week, we barely mentioned religion at all. But we're mentioning it now because non-religious people in the UK have a more positive experience of life and enjoy stronger social networks than those with a deep faith, which is interesting in and of itself. But to me, at least, it's even more interesting when you add in the fact that it puts us in this country at odds with almost the rest of the world, certainly with a global trend where the reverse is usually true. So why would the UK be bucking this global trend? And why would non-religious people be happier than religious people? I'm not sure you can answer both questions consistently because one would almost make a mockery of the other. 0345 6060 973. Mick's in Gateshead. Mick, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm just trying to give my own perspective, which is the perspective of an atheist on this.
Yes, of course.
This might sound rather simple or flippant, but my viewpoint is I have a concept of, or I don't particularly believe in heaven or hell, so I don't actually worry about which one I may or may not be going to. Okay.
Yeah, but so if you were going to heaven, if you were definitely going to heaven, then you'd be a right happy little bunny.
Yeah. I mean, this is a much more generic thing, but whenever they do these surveys of sort of countries, which are the happiest countries,
yes.
I think you'll normally find the top 10 always has the Scandinavian countries in it.
Yes, it does.
Which are generally considered atheist or agnostic or whatever it is. Obviously, I'm 62. I've never been a religious person. Like you said earlier on, you've gone through different phases where you might have had a kind of a bit of a religious experience and then you kind of came out of it.
Not a religious experience. You make it sound like I saw angels. I've derived enormous comfort from going to church at various times in my life, and I've gone through periods of having faith and not having faith. But I don't think I can track my happiness according to whether I'm believing at the time or not. But what you don't have is what I grew up with, which was Catholic guilt. You know, everything.
Yeah, I was just about to say that because my wife is actually a Catholic, and I've actually said that to her many times. I don't have your guilt, Gene. I don't feel guilty about.
How does she greet this? How does she welcome this insight into your different experiences?
It's a very interesting topic, as you might imagine.
Yes, I can imagine. I mean, because you should. I mean, you must have guilt in some context if you do something wrong. I mean, you know, if you stole a biscuit or something, or if you cheated on your wife. I'm not for a minute suggesting that you have. Then there would be guilt there, but it wouldn't be guilt born of religious indoctrination.
Yeah, exactly. What I'm saying is, I'm a moral person. I class myself as a moral person.
Yes.
I don't go around robbing people and stuff like that. I class that as human nature, if you know what I mean. I think that's what you should be indoctrinated with. I don't think you should be religiously indoctrinated.
Yeah, just be excellent. Well, that's what Bill and Ted said, Mick. Bill and Ted said, be excellent to each other.
Yeah.
You don't need a deity or a omniscient, omnipotent power to endorse that mode of living. I've always thought be excellent to each other would be a wonderful motto for humanity itself. But hey ho, we're a long way off that. Quite a lot going on here with the specific nature of the UK. I don't know that we've got there. When you lose faith, says Ollie in Oxford, you gain agency over your life. When you achieve things, you achieve them through your own hard work and not because you've been blessed or because you prayed hard enough. This gives you an increased feeling of joy and pride in yourself. You feel a sense of real achievement and not a sense of having to be grateful to something else for your own hard work. On the flip side, when things go wrong, it may be in your hands to change it, or it may just be bad luck, but it's not because God is punishing you or not answering your prayers. That's a clever point, Ollie. I sometimes balk a bit when sports people thank God for their victory, because I don't know whether or not there's a sort of philosophical response to this, but it sounds as if you're suggesting that God wanted everyone else to lose. So, imagine you come last in a race and the winner thanks God. It's bad enough you came last. Now you've got to deal with the fact that for reasons completely beyond your comprehension, God wanted you to come last. As what? As a punishment for something? And the people who came first are going to somehow, by dint of being the fastest runner in a race, have got some sort of claim to a superior moral compass? I don't know. Amar is in Hackney. Amar, what would you like to say? Amar.
Hi, James. How's it going? You all right?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
So basically, I just wanted to cover a few points. Western society was built on the foundations of the Bible. Now, I'm talking from an ex-Muslim, now Christian point of view.
Oh, wow.
If you go back in history, right, love your neighbors, yourself, all of these different points, this is what gave us the democracy in Western society, Yes. If you look at the Western world and all of the Christian countries, there's democracy, there's peace, and...
Well, there is now, but, there wasn't 90 years ago.
Yeah, well... Look, there's
I am looking.
Right?
So a broad sweep of the Christian era, which would say, give or take, is 2,000 years.
But you could look at it two different ways, James. Right? You could look at it through the Roman Catholic Church point of view of Christianity, right? Which is, as we know, Inquisition has a lot of things. I don't want to discuss it and go deep into it, but there was a lot of things that happened that wasn't right, and that pushed a lot of people away from Christ. Yeah.
Okay.
Then you have the other path, which is the true path of the faith, where people wasn't burnt because they had a Bible, or wasn't punished or put into cells and dungeons and things like that.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to kind of get into was people, when they don't have to follow too many rules, they're generally going to be more happier. Yeah.
Well, no, because in almost every country except the UK, it's the devoutly religious people report being happier than the non-religious people.
Yeah, but this is where I was going to complete the whole
go on then
sentence that I was saying. So, in general, right, people that don't follow too many rules seem happier. So when you see them outside, they seem happier. But when you look at it deeply, me being a Christian and finding my faith has given me joy.
Good.
I've seen miracles take place.
Oh.
I've got inner peace, James.
Good.
And this peace that I've got, I can't explain it to you, but it's a sound mind, James. And I didn't have this with my previous faith. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that faith.
I am genuinely very, very, very happy for you. Genuinely.
Thank you, man. I've even, I've got a channel. I don't want to mention it. It's on a famous place where you upload videos, but I've literally seen people's lives change. People that were suffering.
But you're not answering the question of why non-religious people are generally happier than religious people, though.
Well, what is that? Just in the UK?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when you look at it, right, they're happier because they don't have to follow the rules of what God mentioned. If you look at people now, non-religious people, some of them could be the worst neighbours you could ever wish for. But if you have someone who's Christian or Muslim, something like that, or Hindu, or someone who's kind of religious, you know that these people have morals, and these morals have come down from generation to generation. And
you make some excellent points, and I mean, you're describing people who are truly observing the teachings of whatever religion it is they follow, rather than people who are just wearing a badge, which is part of the problem in politics, with people claiming to be devout Catholics while being obviously in favour of sending children up chimneys. Not mentioning any names, but the difference, as of course, in the context of Christianity, which is the religion I know best, living by Christ's teachings is a recipe for epic altruism and decency, and I'm sure the same is true in other religions. But I don't know why it would make you happier the other way around. Thank you, Amar. Last word on this to Tom, who's in Folkestone. I can only give you a minute, Tom, but make it good.
All right. Hi, James.
Hello.
Well, I'll make it very quick then. I'm the kind of person who's believing in God, but does not believe in religion. Because I believe in God, I believe in his moral values and teachings. I don't believe in restricting myself.
But his teachings are religious. I mean, his teachings are religious. Sorry, I mean, I've possibly been a bit pedantic on the semantics here, but God's perceived teachings, that's what a religion is.
Yeah, but I feel generally happy with life because I don't think, I force myself to go to church. I don't, fast when it's time for fasting.
Yeah.
It's restrictive for me. It feels like religion is a set of rules, like the previous caller said.
You try to be a good person, try to treat others as you would like to be treated yourself, but I don't need all the bells and smells that go with it.
And also, very quickly on the point why we're so different here in the UK, my girlfriend is actually from Philippines and she still lives there, and I've been traveling a lot to other countries as well. What I've realized is in any other country, one single religion is majorly embodied into everyday life.
So everyone feels part of the same. I did warn you we didn't have much time, Tom, so I'm sorry that I'm cutting you off in your prime, but then everyone feels part of the same community. Religion equals community in those kind of countries, but not in all countries. Thank you, mate. Dominus Vobiscum. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, Rewind Live Radio, or enjoy the whole show podcast. You'll also find all of LBC shows there to catch up on, as well as you can stay up to date with the latest news from LBC. Rewind Live Radio on Global Player. Download for free from your app store. Or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 It's time for Sheila Fogarty.